Hello, insatiable listeners. Allie here. We are officially on hiatus in between season 5 and 6, and we will return on Wednesday, November 21st, with an incredible season. Many of these people have been on my bucket list to interview, and bam, they're coming on the show. This episode will support you during the holidays and make sure you set yourself up the best way you can for 2019. And I can't even believe it's going to be 2019, but it's coming. In the meantime, enjoy these interviews where the tables were turned and I was the interviewee. I'm sure you'll get some more insights from these amazing interviewers and their great questions. Enjoy, and I will talk to you with live episodes on Wednesday, November 21st.
Welcome to the Grace and Grit podcast, made for women who want their healthiest years to be ahead of them, not behind them. Join your host, Courtney Townley, right now as she breaks down the fairy tale health story you have been chasing all of your life into sensible action steps and lasting change. Welcome to the Grace and Grit podcast. This is your host, Courtney Townley. Thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. I always appreciate your time and attention. And I really want to take a quick second today at the start of the show to thank those of you who've been rating and reviewing the podcast on iTunes over the past few months. It really means a lot. And I know it takes time on your part to go there and do that. But I also just want to remind you that it really does go a long way in helping to support the podcast and really help us to get more ears on the show. So thank you for that. And I'm going to read quickly just one of the most recent reviews that I got, because I think they're always nice to hear. And I just want to give a little shout out to MLSB31. And she says, I only looked into Grace and Grit because of the strong recommendations from people I trust. I went from never having listened to a podcast before to practically binging on this one. Courtney's respect and passion for women's health are evident throughout, and her reality-based philosophy that each of us, regardless of age or current physical condition, can make small and manageable changes that add up to big benefits over time is a much appreciated breath of fresh air to this 60-year-old. So thank you, MLSB31, for that review. I so deeply appreciate it. And I'll be honest, I was never a person to leave reviews before I started a podcast, because honestly, I didn't really understand the value of them. I might reach out and send somebody an email to tell them how great of a job I thought they were doing, but I didn't understand the power that reviews have to actually get more listeners on the show. So if you have the time, you haven't left a review, I would so immensely appreciate if you would head on over to iTunes and do that. Now, my guest today on the show, Ali Shapiro, is also a podcaster who I'm sure appreciates reviews. And she's also a powerful women's health advocate who, again, I'm just so tickled to have her today. I'm really, really honored that she's here. She's the host of Insatiable, a podcast that is dedicated to the conversation of mending our relationship with food. And because the theme for the month of July on the Grace and Grit podcast is relationships, I reached out to a few colleagues to ask who they would recommend that I interview on the topic of improving relationships with food. And my friend Brody Welch, who many of you are familiar with because she's been on the show several times, she said without hesitation, you have to interview Ali Shapiro. And I am so deeply grateful that she gave me that recommendation, because the deeper I got into Ali's work, the more excited I got. Ali gets health and wellness and this relationship with food in a way that few people do. She pushes hard against diet dogma and is doing remarkable work by encouraging women to stop looking outside of themselves for another list of rules and regulations to follow about how to improve their health, but rather to go in and learn more about who they are and why they do what they do, which of course is the work that lights me on fire. So just a little bit more about her professional bio before we get into the interview here. Ali is the founder of Truce with Food, host of the top-rated podcast Insatiable, a holistic nutritionist, integrated health coach, and rebel with a serious cause. She's academically practically and empathetically aware of how the medical system, diet culture, and body positivity movements all have their own flavor of crazy. I love that. And she created her Truce with Food method while in graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, where she earned her master's in organizational dynamics, which is kind of like getting an MBA in the change process, where she drew from her decade plus of working with real life clients and her own personal healing journey from having cancer as a teenager. So without further ado, I am very excited to introduce to you Miss Ali Shapiro. Ali, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, Courtney. I love your energy. I love the concept of grace and grit. This is just going to be fun.
Yes, it totally is. So I start everybody in the same place of just giving you the opportunity. I read your bio, but of course there's so much more to your story. And I would love for you to maybe just in your own words, share with listeners a little bit about who you are, the work that you do in the world, and really what got you into that work.
Yeah. So I think a great story, we all identify with stories. So I think what got me into this work, even though I didn't know I was getting into this work, was basically at the age of 23, was in the doctor's office struggling with my weight. And even though I was binge eating at night and I was trying to work out and keep up with the calorie deficit that I used to be able to do in high school, right? When you had all the time in the world and no stress to work out forever.
No responsibilities, right?
Yeah. Why can't I get back there? Mortgage, job, kids, right?
Yeah.
I was basically hoping that my doctor was going to tell me something was wrong with my thyroid, right? I mean, and nowadays I'm like so glad I don't. But at the time I was hoping. And as I was waiting for her to come into the exam room to tell me what my blood work had shown, I looked at my medical file, which was hanging there, and it felt kind of, even though it's our medical file, it felt really scandalous to look at.
Right.
I was like, no, that's the teachers, or that's the doctors. I can't look. And I just kind of opened it up and I had just continued to have these diagnoses. I was asthmatic as a child and that was there. And then I had cancer as a teenager. And then after cancer, I was diagnosed with depression in college. And then after my first job, I was diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome. I had reoccurring bouts of acne. And I had tried everything that Western medicine, antibiotics, Accutane, Wellbutrin, Prozac, Celexa. And I just kind of had this realization that, oh my God, I am free of cancer. And that is a wonderful definition, a wonderful place to be, but I am not healthy by any means. And it just kind of made me realize that if we're going to think of health on a continuum, like I had gotten to zero, right? Like cancer is probably like negative 1,000 and I was at 100 at zero, but like, was there this other side of the continuum that I could get to? And the doctor came in, she told me my thyroid was fine. And she told me to eat less, move more. And she gave me a recommendation to eat salmon, canned salmon, and sprinkle Splenda on top of it.
Oh dear.
And yeah, and you can look back and be like, all right, all of this information has been out there, but it was the doctor recommending Splenda, which I knew from my own research and independent studies had been a carcinogen. In other words, it had contributed to cancer in preliminary studies. And I walked out of there just intuitively knowing that I wasn't going to get my answers from Western medicine. And that was a real turning point. Now, it's not like everything changed at that moment, right?
Sure.
I started becoming open to other information. Specifically, I was able to separate weight from health, which I hadn't done until that point. I had really configured the two. And because I was binging and emotionally eating, the pain point really was, how do I lose weight, not to how do I get healthy? But I really realized at that moment that I was going to have to give up dieting. And because I was so obsessed with losing weight, I basically said to myself, you're just going to have to learn to live being fat, and you're just too tired. You can't do this anymore. And, endings are beginnings, right? And that really opened me up. And I basically figured out how to reverse everything that had been on my chart, my depression, my irritable bowel syndrome. My skin cleared up. I wasn't taking reflux medication at 23 for my IBS. And I lost 15 pounds as a side effect of this by not focusing on my weight. But I was just thrilled to be off all these medications. And it was really a shining moment, but it was also a dark night of the soul because I thought, why did I not know about this? Why doesn't everybody know about this? Why are we still looking at food as this battle and only through calories? And why are we looking at the body as like this area to have war on? And we have the war on cancer, war on depression. And we think those are just words, but they really influence how we approach the body, food. And it really sent me down a rabbit hole. I started reading books. I entered grad school to really figure out why more people didn't know about this. And it's a lot more complicated. It's simple, but complicated, right? It's always a tension of opposites. And so it really became my mission that people in life have independent choices. The body is very complex. I'm not someone who's, no medication, only food, or only this. It's a lot more complicated, but I wanted people to know that they had choices other than what was being offered. And what's been really interesting in the 15 years since I started my journey is I realized, first of all, how important emotional health is in relation to all of this. My depression, I got about halfway there, healing my gut, which I had realized had been destroyed from chemotherapy. Once I did that, there was still an emotional component to depression. And so what I realized is a lot of people have hit a ceiling with dieting or with only focusing on the food. And that has become really my personal mission to realize that I really like maximum results. Like I'm about efficiency, elegance. I want everyone to have these choices and get great results. And so that's basically why I dedicated myself to graduate school. I've done the heavy lifting of researching this both academically and practically. And then I have the personal insight to realize that it wasn't what everyone was saying the problem was, which is what willpower and discipline. And why did we think that? And so it's kind of a long way of saying that basically as I turn almost 40 here in October, I feel healthier today than I ever have in my life because I was weight watching at 11 and struggling with my life. So it started early. So I'll put a period there for now.
Yeah. And you gave yourself permission to go a different way, which is really, at such a young age, I think that's incredibly mature because as you well know, I know lots of women in their 40s, 50s and beyond who are really in that space of rumbling with this exact idea that they know that current diet dogma isn't working for them. And they want to rebel against it. They want to stop focusing on the weight. And what we hear as a solution to that is just love your body. And it's like, well, how the hell do you do that? That's
right.
That's a big extreme. It's like one extreme to the other.
Well, right. And I think because we're an all or nothing culture, which is part of the problem that I realized is that we are in this cultural matrix of extremes, right? And so, when you look at even what's popular and I used to live, and I have so much compassion for this because I think part of why we don't, you can't just be against something, right? I was like against cancer unconsciously for 10 years. And it's like, well, what do we want to be for? And I think we don't have a really great option. That's why I joke my work is option C. It's this moderate middle path. But when you look at the news, the only thing that gets reported is like extreme studies or people put like if you hear something about a supplement, it's filtered through a media that says this will be the silver bullet, right? And then people start taking vitamin D and nothing changes. And they're like, oh, natural health doesn't work, right? And it's like, well, no, that's not it's right? And so we really have to, and that's a big reason I take a social justice lens or what I call a political lens. I just mean culture, who has the power lens, because you have to see what matrix you're in. You're in a culture that wants you to bounce back and forth. No, there isn't, and don't get me wrong, there isn't like a man behind the screen like the Wizard of Oz controlling all of this, right? That's another story, right? Then we get into conspiracy theories. It's just how it has happened is that everyone's looking out for themselves. We live in a capitalistic healthcare system, a capitalistic media that thrives on us not knowing our own power, because then we eat more, we buy more, we consume more. So that's kind of a tangent, but it's hard matrix to get out of. Well,
and I think a lot of people would probably listening to this, on some level would agree that they aren't even aware of the matrix, right? Like it's like we're so busy and we're so consumed by life. And then when we have a little bit of downtime, we're watching a TV or we're being, brainwashed by social media. And I don't even think we realize the impact it's having on on our matrix, essentially, right?
Yes, right. We recover from the matrix in the evening, right? That's part of the matrix. You just like think, it's like a ping pong game. Yeah, no. And that's one of the things that was so, I grew up in a very, my parents were both city school teachers. My dad grew up in the projects of Pittsburgh, very poor. My mom grew up on an organic farm. It wasn't called organic at the time. It just was farming. And so my parents, I guess you could kind of say, were hippies, even though they came from different paths. And they were obviously not just living off the land. They were, and I grew up in a very feminist house. So we didn't call it that, but my parents both made the same amount of money. They both had equal power. I didn't realize, we never said the word feminist, but how progressive my parents were. And I thought I knew some of this because my dad is someone who's always been, both parents, voracious readers and kind of always telling us about the system behind why things were happening. And even I learned later on that my parents actually researched chemotherapy when I was diagnosed. And chemotherapy happens to be very effective for Hodgkin's disease, which is the type of cancer I had. But, my mom was ready to send me to a juice farm. And my dad was like, hell no. My mom's like the free spirit. My dad's like, what are you talking about, Willis? This is... but I thought that I was pretty far outside the matrix. And I was like, oh, that's a sign you're still in the matrix. When you think you're out of it.
Yeah, that's so true. So I want to ask you, how do you define health today? What's your definition of health? Because you specifically said that you had that moment in the doctor's office or after that appointment when you went into the doctor because you were having weight issues and you had that moment of clarity that health and weight were separate.
Yeah. So I love this that you asked this question because my definition of health is, are you alive? Are you full of vitality? And what I mean by that is, are you taking chances? I believe a lot in nature, and nature has this creative impulse, right? Like nature is always, yes, there's death, but it's always creating, right? And I don't care if someone has a diagnosis, what their weight is. I want to know, are you open to life? And are you taking that creative energy and doing something that matters to you with it? And if you look from a Chinese medicine lens, we know that stagnation causes disease as much as inflammation, right? Mm-hmm. And I think when we are saying, are we alive, to keep that flow going and to keep the fire, that it's not stress, it's stress can be positive, but it's taking the challenging things in our life and making something meaningful out of them. To me, that's what with health and wellness are. And I think that's accessible to anyone, which is the exciting thing.
I love that, Allie. This idea of associating taking chance and living. Are you fully alive? I love that question because I see so many women suffering needlessly because they are consistently living in a space of indecision.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's part of, unfortunately, that's part of our health culture. When you're living in indecision, I really see it as I get to hear this from my clients a lot, oh my God, I'm so indecisive. My thoughts are kind of racing. We're not really in our body, right? There's four ways of knowing. And there's your thoughts, which is where the indecision comes from, but there's feelings, sensing, which is your senses, smell, touch, hearing, and then intuition, that gut instinct. And in our culture, we really only give ourselves access to that top one, and which is the indecision. And so I know someone's feeling really unsafe when they have all that indecision. They don't want to make the wrong choice, the right choice. And that's part of the battle mentality, actually. If we talk about relationship and how we're actually relating to ourselves and our body, we don't even know what the pattern is of that relationship. But in essence, we're assuming that we're wrong, right? Mm-hmm. Right? Isn't that kind of what indecision is? We're not, and I can talk about why that is if you're curious, but we're really coming at this from a basis of, I'm wrong. I don't know what to do. I can't be, I don't know. When we can know, and we can learn to know. Is that clear?
No, it is. And I think that statement, I don't know, is honestly a way of not having to make a decision. Because when we open ourselves to making actual decisions, we also risk failing.
Yes, it's resistance. That's what I talk about with my clients. You don't have to analyze your thoughts. You just need to know when you're in indecision, that's a symptom that you're feeling unsafe. You're feeling like you have to go to battle or that you're wrong for some reason. And once they get that, oh my God, I don't have to analyze the thoughts. I'm just feeling like I'm in conflict in some way. Yeah. And that's ultimately what a lot of my model is based around is we are always worried about doing the wrong thing, which leads to failure, right? Or leads to things falling apart or whatnot. And so we take this battle, again, it's not just words, but we take this, I've got to fight myself. I've got to gear up. I've got to go to boot camp, right? The whole way we approach the body. And if we are in, and it's not physical conflict per se, but it's an emotional, psychological conflict. And there's actually, fortunately, thanks to some people named the Thomas Kilmann conflict model, we know the patterns of what happens when we are in psychological conflict. And what you were talking about is kind of a way of avoiding. Avoiding is one of the patterns when we're in conflict. So do you want me to go through the different styles?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Okay, yeah. And let me back up by saying where these kind of take place, because this is, I want it to be as concrete for people. So basically what happens is I've realized that there's what I call this auto-eating spiral. But the auto-eating spiral could be the overthinking spiral. It could be the over-drinking spiral. It could be the I'm going to be a sloth on the couch spiral, right? The all or nothing spiral. That is what my clients really struggle with, is that all or nothing. And what is happening in this spiral is you get an emotional hit. And it's not, what's really important, especially women, we are so conditioned to want to be wanted. And what I mean by that is we're conditioned to say, how's that going to make me look? What are people going to think of me? And that's part of where that indecision comes, right? So we're actually not even attuned to our own emotional response. We are self-critical, but not self-aware. So we get an emotion, say we've been scrolling through social media, right? People say social media is a trigger, or the scale is a trigger, but ultimately those things are neutral. It's what does it trigger within us? And so there's a feeling that happens, and they're usually vulnerable feelings. It could be uncertainty. It could be inadequacy. It could be fear, whatever it is. And then we have a story about what that means, right? And we usually, and all of this is happening within like seconds, right? Because the brain can be amazing that way, because if you if you see something where you have to run, you want this amazing processing capacity. So it's not all bad. But you have this emotional response, right? And then immediately there's a story associated with that emotional response. So it's not even the emotion itself. This means I could fail, to your example, right? This could mean I'm going to be rejected. This could mean I don't belong, right? That's what social media does to us. Or even the scale. Oh my God, if I don't weigh, if I'm heavy, and we know that there's weight discrimination. So what I always tell people, we often talk about stories today, and a lot of people have talked about story, but they talk as if the story is made up and only in our head. Right. But again, these stories come from our past. And I'll provide some concrete examples when we get to that. But, for me, I'll just do it right now so it makes it clear. I had a story associated with uncertainty. I was diagnosed with cancer, which meant life or death, like things were going to fall apart. And what I didn't realize at the time, and why I was binging or emotionally eating, was because I never healed that, any drop of uncertainty sent me into a tailspin. I didn't eat right for that meal. Oh my God, everything's ruined. I missed a workout, right? On the surface, it was just about my body, but it was also like, oh my God, at the time I was single, but I haven't gone on a date. I don't know how to date. What? I can't date. My job, I don't really like it. I don't know what I'm going to do with my life, right? It was like these smaller ripples. And so then what happens is, so for me, I'll just use this as an example. And this is a very common one with my clients. So it's also why I like to use it. I have the feeling of uncertainty. There's a story that the past is always echoing today in our bodies. And then we have a stress response. And the stress response is these conflict styles, right? In physiology, we would call it fight, flight, or freeze. But there's actually psychological associations. And those three styles, and again, I've adapted this from the Thomas Kilmann conflict model, which is in our adult development research, is some people go into competitor mode. And competitor is where we go, okay, I'm going to compare myself to either my old body or what I used to do. I'm going to compare myself to the woman next to me, or I'm going to compare myself and to everybody, right? And I'm going to get ahead, right? And this is often why we turn to prefab diets. Like I'm going to win, and I'm going to get ahead of this diet, right? And or some people avoid, and we affectionately, can I swear? Can I say?
Yeah, of course. Yes.
Okay. On this, on avoid, we call it the chuck it, fuck it mode in Truth with Food. It's like, And one way we avoid is we start reading more about nutrition, or we're like, I'm going to try that, or I'm just going to get into fitness, or I'm just going to go on social media, right? And then, or I'm going to procrastinate, right? And then we learn about how not to procrastinate when really procrastination isn't the issue. All of this stuff is protecting us in a way. Or we go into accommodate mode. And accommodate is where, okay, I'm going to do what you tell me. And this is really, and that's what I had been doing, right? I accommodated my doctors when I was diagnosed with cancer. And that really protected me and was really useful. And all of these styles of conflict have protected us at one point, and they're not all inherently bad or good. That saved my life, accommodating and listening to my doctors. But that same thing, when I was trying to get healthy, listening to those doctors was actually what was sabotaging me. But I didn't know that at the time because I didn't see this pattern. And so what we have is, again, emotion, story, stress response, and then we have behaviors that come from that. So in accommodation mode, what I was doing is I was listening to the doctors, I was taking the medication that they gave me, right? Avoid people, they withdraw. They don't say anything. They try to find a new exercise or they try to find a new diet to experiment with. Competitors, they start working harder, right? Because they feel behind or they start going to more extremes. And what is happening in traditional change is we're looking at the behaviors. We're like, oh, how do I do this diet better? Or how do I learn more? When really that's actually the problem, right? These are protective behaviors that then they don't work and they create a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure, of things falling apart. And we do this over years and decades. And we start to think, oh, this is who I am. Mm-hmm. I have failed. Things are falling apart. My life was falling apart when I was 23. Like that was not a story. But one of the quotes that is very popular in Truth with Food, and it was made popular by Gloria Steinem and Aaron Brockovich, is the truth will set you free, but first it's going to piss you off. And so that is what happens though, is that battle mode. And that's what I really hope people will start to take a look at in their lives is, how am I competing, right?
Yeah.
And when we're competing, we don't value the relationship with our body. We value our goal, but not the relationship with our body. When we're avoiding, and this could be, or the relationship with someone else, right? Whatever relationship we're sabotaging in a way when we're competing. When we're avoiding, we don't value the relationship with our body and we don't value our goal. We're like, nope, I'm going to put that off. And it's actually not that important to me, even though it may feel that important. If I'm avoiding, it's actually not on my priority list. If we're accommodating, we value the relationship, but not our own goal. And so this tends to be where you get your fixers, people pleasers, where people are overgiving. And they're doing that because they like that accommodate. It's protecting them. So the challenge to get out of this is, first of all, recognizing what we're feeling and all that stuff. But more importantly, is recognizing there's a better way. And we can shift the relationship into collaboration. And that is where we value our goal, right? We don't have to give up being healthy, or if we want to change the shape of their body. This is controversial. I know I don't focus on weight loss, but I also don't think we should be telling women what they should or shouldn't want with their lives. I feel like that's recreating the patriarchy, just putting lipstick on it. Yeah. And this is controversial too, but like me, even though I had given up weight loss, really wanting to learn to discover my body and what was happening created the biggest transformation in my life. And so because you have awareness, right? I mean, yeah, you became curious. Yes. And I learned what I was projecting onto weight loss, which we can talk about in how we relate to things. But with collaboration, you value your goal and your body. But that starts to get to collaboration. You have to start understanding what your body's saying. And this is kind of where it gets matrixy. You know, I'll use the example of depression. I was diagnosed with depression and I was told it was a serotonin deficiency. Well, turns out it's actually not. Right? My gut was destroyed and I had PTSD from having had cancer and I had to work through that shit. Right? Like taking any of these pills were not going to help me with that. You know, people think that they can't stick with the diet because they don't have willpower or discipline. When I'm like, actually, this is protecting you. This is protecting you. This whole pattern is protecting you because it protected you in the past. We actually have to work not on self-sabotage, but how can you truly protect yourself in a healthier way than overwhelm and stress and turning to food? So that is where collaborating and really getting to the root of what's happening. Cravings, for example. Oh my God, people think they have cravings because they're weak, right? No, you're probably not eating the right foods for yourself. Right. But that requires not looking at your body as everything that's coming up is something to battle, but rather an invitation to listen.
One thing that I've certainly learned through decades of helping hundreds of women to better their health is that community matters. If you're loving these podcasts and want to join a community of women who are striving to take better care of themselves more consistently, head on over to Facebook and join the Women of Grace and Grit Facebook community, where we continue the conversations of these podcasts and talk about all things related to women's health. You can find that Facebook page at facebook.com/groups/Grace and Grit. Hope to see you there. And I also love, what you brought up there is that, so often what is going on, like, let's just say we have a physiological sensation or dis-ease developing in our body. So we have trouble with our gut, or we're getting headaches, or whatever the case may be. It's usually not just one thing. It can be, absolutely, but there's usually a multitude of things that are causing that. It's not just one thing. And yet we always kind of look for that one answer, rather than looking at the whole big picture to see what all the contributors might be. And I think also that's what I'm hearing in you describing, just sort of the style of conflict, first of all. The style of conflict for most of us is an automatic response. Like, we're reacting, we're not really responding, right? With our conflict, with our style of conflict, because we're not even aware that we're doing it. And I can definitely testify to this because I have ways of reacting in my life that I'm becoming very aware are not serving me. And so my self-discovery, of course, has led me into that space of exactly what you're talking about, realizing that so many people in my life who really had good intentions to try to help me with certain things were always only focusing on behavior. If you do this, right, it will change everything. But the reality was there were so many other layers, which you're speaking so beautifully to, which is the emotion, the story, the stress. Like, there's all these underlying layers that are influencing that behavior. And so if I don't peel the onion back and get to those other layers, that behavior change is never going to stick.
Yeah. And what makes it even a little bit more complicated and is that when we're in this protective mode, not realizing that we're in protection, we also generate these emotions like anger or resentment or guilt, which are protective emotions. But then we think that they're, I'm wrong.
They define us. Yeah.
Yeah. Or I'm a horrible person because I'm angry or resentful. It's like, no, you're actually protecting yourself against speaking up, and you're resentful because you're not speaking up, but it's protective that way. To not speak, you believe it's protective. And I will just, I'm very evidence-based, but this is not an official study, but what I have seen in my practice with my clients and with my own journey is that about 80% of conflict is perceived. It's not even real. And it's because we're not clear on our needs and we're not unclear on the needs of the situation. Right. And I can give you a ton of examples about that of like how this leads to all of this. But to your point, what you were saying within your own life, like, you probably didn't know what you needed. The other people often aren't clear what they need. Right.
Right.
And so it's like, blind
leading the blind, basically.
Yes. In my programs, we laugh. We're like, how does anybody communicate? Like, nobody's really communicating, right? And I mean, and I think everyone can relate to this. Like, my husband, like, used to try to fix things when I was like upset. And I was like, why am I getting so irritated? And I was like, I don't want him to fix it. I just want him to listen. Especially, I'm an extrovert. He's an introvert. And so I had to ask him, right? And we're always more effective if we can ask people things to do, not to do. And I'm like, honey, if you would just listen, that's all I need right now. And it was funny. The first couple times we would try this, he would be like, I could see him like holding back, wanting to give advice, Mm-hmm. But ultimately he wasn't frustrated because he can't fix it. And I'm resourceful and resilient and I can figure it out. I just needed a sounding board. And and that has changed our relationship, because the same is with him. And then he would be like, I'm not one of your clients. I don't need coached. And I'm like, okay, I'm just going to listen,
Mm-hmm.
But it would create this like frustration back and forth with us that really was unnecessary once we both got clear on what we needed.
Yeah, I love that. That's awesome. I want you to speak a little bit about agency with your body, because you speak of this a lot in your writing, and I've heard you mention it on podcasts. But what does it mean to have agency with your body?
Oh, thanks for asking, because it's a big word that means something very simple. So agency, how I'm defining, there's a couple different definitions depending on what science field you're in, but I'm talking about independent choice. Mm-hmm. And by independent choice, I mean you actually know what your choices are. And what's interesting, if we look at basically the conflict styles, we think the choices are I'm ahead or behind, it's all or nothing. It's either or. Either they get their way or I get my way, right? So we think we only have binary choices, right? But there's a whole other creative, there's choices C, D, E, F, G, H when you get to that collaborative space, when you can really create with what's unfolded. And so if we go back to my example, like when I was 22, 23, like I didn't know that getting off packaged foods and taking out, for me, I had to get rid of gluten and like taking some digestive enzymes were a choice. I thought I only had a choice between antidepressants and antacids and different acne medication. And so I want people to know that they have other choices out there. They don't have to settle with fighting their body or giving up, right? Which are kind of what people think they have those choices. And they don't have the choices. They don't have to have the choices of having the same fights with the same people, or they don't have to put up with a shitty boss, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that you change jobs, because that's not a privilege everyone has. But I always say, like when we change our internal, because what happens is we kind of put grease on the fire when we're in a story, or when we.
Oh man, do we? I'm good at that.
Yeah. Oh, I'm really good at it. Like, you're great at poking and leaving. And I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, you jab and leave. And I'm like, oh, you're right.
Yeah.
So like I said, part of I know this is because this was me. Like, oh man. And people are like, oh, I'm like, I'm the most stubborn person. We have to teach what we need to learn. This is
of course. Yep, I get it.
I teach the change process because I am stubborn. Stubborn is all heck. I like to call it discerning, but it's stubborn. But so having this independent choice is really knowing what choices you have. And, what's really cool is my clients, they come in looking for food. I joke, it's like come in for relief, leave with life-changing freedom. And so like if you have a shitty boss or you have a tense relationship with your child, whatever it is, when you start to realize you can manage your own reaction, you don't change them, but you don't trigger their protective mechanisms. Because what we kind of joke is everyone is like 5, 6 or 7 year old walking around in adult clothing, right? Oh, yeah. So it's like an adult bag of bones, right? And so it's like everyone's just reacting usually on their protective sides, especially when things are tense. And so when we can be the bigger person, I had a client who she had like a really frustrating dynamic with her boss. And when she stopped actually learning, she was accommodating him. And when she stopped taking on his reactions, the whole entire dynamic shifted. Like it was healthier for her. She got clear on what she needed. She was able to see his reactions with the team as his own protective mechanism. And she could put that aside and soften and get clear on what he needed. And it shifted the entire dynamic. And I'm like, that's leadership, right? Like all leadership is really self-leadership. But she changed that whole dynamic by collaborating with her own emotional reaction, not reacting, by taking on his stuff, which is a pattern she had done forever with people in authority positions because it came from her parents, to now like shifting the entire team.
Which is really the secret to any good relationship, right?
Yeah. And then you start repairing that relationship because you guys end up having, this isn't magical thinking, of like, oh, I just don't care anymore. It's like, no, I care so deeply and I want this work environment to be a safe place. And so the relationship doesn't happen overnight, but has started to heal, right? And there's trust there again because there was an amazing outcome that one day in the surgery room. They finished effectively. Everyone was happy. They had a good time versus it kind of being the tension field and like, that it was.
Yeah. In one of the podcasts of yours I listened to recently, I heard you say that, part of the healing process and really this truce with food is about learning how, like being willing to dissect rather than constantly looking for the formula to follow. And I'm sure I'm butchering your words there, but it was something along those lines, right? We have to be willing to be teachable, be willing to stay curious, be willing, like you're saying right now, to collaborate with ourselves and our knowing and our not knowing to be able to understand ourselves better. Because we think we know ourselves so well. And I would argue, I'm 41 and I am learning stuff about myself that I really would much rather have kept in the dark for a really long time. And yet I also know it's helping me to move me to higher ground. And it's actually making me, helping me to create change in my life that I otherwise know would have never been possible.
Totally. I always tell people they think that they don't have any issues. That's their biggest issue, right?
Yeah, of course.
Away from those people. I will say though, and again, part of why I created this framework, it's really a framework, a process, because I think part of why everyone will tell you to learn your body, but no one teaches you how. Yeah. And because it's so matrixy, I have compassion for people who are like, I want to learn my body and it be because part of the challenge is, right, all of us are usually triggered by uncertainty. And so you're forced, we call it closing the story loop or keeping the story loop open in Truce with Food, is when you're trying to figure yourself out, you're keeping that uncertainty open. You're like, is this going to work, right? That's part of the safety of relying on someone else's ideas and formula. It's really a safety choice. It's not... It's emotionally fulfilling, like, oh, they said this worked. Well, it worked for them. And let me tell you, a lot of people in the health and wellness field, it's their full-time job to focus on health and wellness. And that's so much part of their identity. And so you have to look at their incentives, right? For being so extreme, I think, versus my clients, and even myself, I don't want food to be the focus of my life. I want health.
Yeah, exactly.
Be the foundation to taking chances, to expressing myself emotionally on that soul level, which, soul is that unique individual imprint that only we can make, versus spirituality is kind of like how we're all one. And I think the deeper way, weight loss offers, not only does the weight loss scale our bodies, it offers us this whole matrix of, this is how you know that you're being productive. If you counted your food today, if you worked out, if you resisted, if you checked in with your Weight Watchers online boards. But when you start unraveling that, right, this is what has happened to a lot of my clients. And it's like, oh my God, what do I do with all my time? What's going to be, And right. I mean that in like a very,
of course,
like exit. And I joke that people who don't have religion find nutrition, right? It's like, okay, I don't, it's like, okay, this is what's going to make my life count. But for most people, they don't want health and wellness to be the front and center. We can value it, but to value it doesn't mean it has to be the whole pie of your values and the central organizing force.
Correct. And I do think on the flip side of that, it is normal to some extent when someone is making health a priority for the first time, maybe ever in their life, that is going to feel a little bit more time consuming, or, they're going to have to put a little more attention on it in order to shift it for a time. Not that it's going to be the center of their life forever, but there is a certain level of attention. It's just like if I want to improve my finances, I'm going to have to put attention there, right?
For sure. That's a great point. Yeah. And what I wanted to say to listeners is I really encourage you to find people who are going to teach you about yourself and not give you formulas or steps. And I know the temptation, and one of my favorite quotes is by Wendell Berry, who is a farmer. And he's like, and I may be butchering it, but he's basically like, when we no longer know which way to go, when the mind is basically perplexed, I say perplexed, but he says, when we no longer know what to do, the mind isn't impeded and our real work begins. Mm-hmm. And I just love that concept because we have to kind of tire out the mind, and a lot of my clients will be like, I'm going to be honest, you're my last resort. And I'm like, don't mind me. But that also means you're open to something really different. So
they hit that brick wall hard enough. It's like they're willing to try a new path.
That's what happened to me. I probably would still be dieting. I was just fucking exhausted. Exactly. I was like, I can't do this anymore. So
I was working with a coach of mine recently, and she was really speaking a lot to what you're saying right now about just having to go in, right? And look at some of the stuff that you're feeling and where it's coming from. And my response to her literally was, you're asking me to do something with time that I don't have to feel things I don't want to feel. And she laughed and she said, exactly. And this is primarily why a lot of us don't do the work, because we are not making time for it. And because it feels, in some ways, you spoke to that space of uncertainty and how we really try to avoid uncertainty so much. I know I do. I do not like being uncertain. And yet it's almost a requirement to be able to retell our story or reshape our story, because we can't find other possibilities if we're not willing to step into uncertainty. And so my question to you is just this idea of starting to collaborate, right, with our bodies and sort of improve our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with food. What is the entry point? Like, how do we start opening the door to that collaboration? Like, what are some really simple things you could tell listeners that would just help to sort of, light a spark?
Yeah. Great question. And I just want to say, to your point about, first of all, you're so right. Like, I don't have time to feel things I don't want to feel. One of the things I realize, though, is that we're dealing with those feelings, whether we look at them or not.
It's so true.
Right? Like, if you're someone who's like just endlessly dieting or like endlessly hating your body, like you're like, why is this happening? That's uncertainty. So I'm like, I always tell clients, you get to choose your hard, right? That's the independent choice. You can continue to be with the uncertainty that you're familiar with, this endless dieting cycle, or you can be with uncertainty that has a really good shot of opening you up to resilience and a much better life. And all of us are going to have to disintegrate who we thought we were to get to that bigger peak. So I just want to point that out, because that is often incentivizing for people to start to tune in, which is what we can talk about now.
And I love how you termed that, just choose your hard, because I always talk about this idea that discomfort it's necessary either way. Like, you get to choose your discomfort because you can't avoid all of it. Discomfort is going to be a traveling companion, whether you want it to be or not, but you get to choose the type of discomfort you want to lean into, the kind that really isn't going to have any positive outcome in the end and possibly take you to a worse place by not changing, or you lean into the discomfort of actually changing.
Yeah. And what's super cool, and this is like what Dr. Carol Dweck talks about.
Love her. Yeah.
Is that after a while, and this is why I love this work and why I'm still doing it, is you start running towards uncertainty. Okay, you don't run towards uncertainty, but
I'm not there yet.
You start taking on bigger and bigger challenges. I see in my work, after my clients are done with Truths with Food, like about 80% of them switch. There's an adjustment in their career. Either they start taking chances of leading in ways that are more true to them. They change jobs, and they're now the choices that they want. And they're like, I have the tools and the skills to navigate this, rather than, recreate the story that I was in before. But that's when it starts getting really fun, is if you can stick with this process for about a year, dig yourself out, then you get to, like, again, not just to zero, you're like towards the continuum of like, bring on the challenges.
Yeah.
I think that's when we're most awakened. And so the same feeling that used to make you feel so unsafe, you're like, okay, this means something different. This means keep going, and I know how to navigate this now. So that's the exciting thing. It's not like dieting gets harder. This gets like, I don't want to say it gets easier, you get stronger.
It changes your relationship with fear. Absolutely.
Totally. So entry points. I love that you asked that. So I really want to start with awareness, because again, so many clients think they're self-aware. They've been in therapy, but they are self-critical. Okay. Yes. They know how to manage other people's responses to look good. So even just labeling, I'm feeling something here. I don't know about you, Courtney, but so many of my clients, we kind of use the analogy of a bobblehead. Like, I just feel like I'm a floating head here, like I'm so disconnected from my body. And so really just starting to say, I'm feeling something here. Next time you want to go for food, or you want to you want to skip working out when you know it would, or movement. I like the term movement. Work, whatever the quote self-sabotaging behavior is, stop for a second, and again, sometimes this will be after the fact because the memory of our nervous system can be so overpowering. Often we will catch this after the fact. So I often encourage people in the beginning to do it at the end of the day and look at where did you start thinking about food a lot, right? And start to just label, what was I feeling? What was I feeling there? And what you were feeling, not what other people were feeling. And then say, what was my response there? Did I go into competitor mode? And start to label this because you'll start to be able to say, oh my God, and I use this example. One client of mine when I first started, and she was just on the podcast, she talked about how she even thought like her self-care, the one self-care she did like once a month was get a pedicure, but she was a big time accommodator. And she goes, oh my God, I went on that Thursday at 5:00 because that's when my manicurist could do it. I was accommodating her even in my self-care, and so start to look at, oh my God, these patterns of what, am I competing? Am I avoiding? Am I accommodating? And on my website, you can take a quiz to see what we cycle through these, but you can see which one's really prominent for you right now. Mm-hmm. And that awareness. And then the third step is rather than just reacting, I loved how you said reacting versus responding, is then asking, what do I need here? And it may not come right away. And sometimes it does, and we're afraid about it. Like you said, permission, right? But like, what would I have needed in that situation? And then also asking the other person, or the situation. I'll give you an example of one of my clients is an attorney, and she was assuming the deadlines on these really challenging briefs that she had to write. She was assuming what the deadlines were, and I said, "Why don't you go ask the partner?" And it turned out they were 2 weeks later than what she had. But she was an avoider, right? So avoiders really like build up the all or nothing, right? It's like it's got to be perfect, so it's got to be intense, and it's got to be dramatic. And it was like, oh my God, I can do this in 2 weeks. There's no stress. It was imagined. It was perceived. So really getting clear on what is needed of the situation and for yourself. And then starting to realize like, what's the creative solution here? So that's the awareness, the labeling of what your stress response is, and then asking what you need and what the situation needs will be hugely relieving. And I will tell you, a lot of clients just noticing and labeling, what was I feeling here? Yeah. Is enough for those like mindless eating moments. They're like, realizing, oh, I'm actually really tired. Okay, I need to go out and get some sunlight if I'm at work, or I need to just go to bed early. Really, again, and I use this quote, Einstein said if he had an hour to save the world, he'd spend more time defining the problem than solving it. Mm-hmm. And getting back to that root cause, if we really think the problem's food, and giving the power to the food, saying, oh my God, I need more rules, oh my God, I need more tips to breathe, or I need to journal. It's like, yeah, you can journal, but like all my journals were about food and how much I love food, right? It's like, no, we need to turn in what's happening here and how am I reacting? And that is life-changing, even more than, just kind of, I know this sounds like a tangent, but a lot of mindfulness eating, we're just being mindful of the same way that we're looking at the situation. And it's kind of ruminating our thoughts. Oh my God.
Why am I the problem? Yeah.
Yeah. So really understanding and getting this clarity is the step. The beginning way in.
I love it. I think that it's so on point and so helpful. And I know listeners will appreciate that. And one of the things I tell clients a lot is that, self-care always looks different. We're so conditioned to believe that self-care is always our diet and exercise. And there's such small parts of the conversation. They're very powerful parts of the equation. They're very important. And yet, if I pause in the day and recognize why I'm engaging in a self-sabotaging behavior, it's not because of food or exercise. It's because of something else. Mm-hmm. And it's influencing my relationship with those other things. And so it's, we keep hyper-focusing on those two pieces of this equation. And really, it's just so much bigger than that, which I think you've just done an awesome job speaking to.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, relationship is invisible, right? So it's harder to see than like, we're such a materialistic culture. So it's like, oh, it's got to be what we see, and we take everything so literally. And it's like, there's always a metaphor. And what I love looking at these patterns of competing, avoiding, and accommodating is, on my podcast, we're going to do a series of like how eating triggers. And we're talking about social media, clothing, the scale, and aging. And it's like, sometimes people think they have all these problems. And it's like, no, it's just one pattern. And again, I'm about efficiency. And it's like, oh my God, if I can deal with this pattern of accommodating, I clear up so many things rather than trying to approach everything like, oh, better tips and tricks for social media. I mean, tactical things can help if your problem really is just a lack of education. But if you've tried something forever and it's a stubborn habit, you got to look below the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg.
Yes, so agreed. This has been great. I have a question I ask all my guests, and I'm going to ask you because I think you'll speak really well to this. But I want these terms of grace and grit, these characteristics, these qualities. I would love for you to define them, how you interpret them, and how they've influenced your own life, either professionally or personally.
I just feel emotional when you ask me that.
Yeah.
Grace to me is opening up to the mystery, the great mystery. To me, nature is kind of my guiding path, and it's so mysterious. And I'm amazed at the grit and resilience and beauty that nature produces. So grace to me is opening up to the mystery and really being open to it and dancing with it. Grit, it's something I like to think I have. Grit to me, I think of digging deep, even when the mud's in your face and it's like getting into that root chakra and like, that primal screen of like, I'm going to keep doing this because it matters to me, not just to do it and not just to be in pain, to be in pain.
Yeah.
But because I can contribute and turn this into something, and I can take a shower afterwards.
Yeah, I love that. And I love how you termed that. Like you're doing it because it's important to you. And I think that so often we don't even stop to ask if this thing that I'm so consumed by is important to me.
I know. And we're total dieting. I always tell this story. I was like studying abroad in London and we met these guys and they were so cool. And they were telling us how they surfed and did all this stuff. And they're like, what's your hobby? And I was like, in my mind, I'm like, dieting?
Oh, Allie.
I didn't say that. Oh no, I managed my image. I was like, travel and learning. But I was like, holy shit, my hobby is dieting. I need to figure something else out.
So any parting words for listeners? Of course, I want you to tell people how they can find out more about you and all that good stuff as well.
Yeah, I think for everyone, I just want you to know that you are a wonder and not a widget. There is so much mystery and brilliance to uncover, no matter how long you've been fighting with food. And there's so much, it can be so much better. And you'll be happy that you took the path and just find people who are going to help you get in touch with yourself. Those are my parting words.
Oh, I love it. I love it. And the best place for people to connect with you.
Yeah. Like I said, if people want to really understand these patterns, even in more detail, I think AllieShapiro.com, we have a What's Your Comfort Eating Style quiz. And I get a lot of the feedback that the questions were interesting to people. And they're like, how's this going to tell me something about myself? But then they were like, you nailed it. So I would recommend everyone take that quiz because it can start to bring that clarity faster. So we can get on to the business of healing.
And such important business that is.
Yes.
Oh, Allie, I so appreciate the work you're doing in the world. I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us. And I really do hope our paths cross again soon.
Yes. Thank you for having me, Courtney.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to the Grace and Grit podcast. It is time to mend the fabric of the female health story. And it starts with you taking radical responsibility for your own self-care. You are worth the effort. And with a little grace and grit, anything is possible.